verdict on Britain's role in the Iraq War: flawed intelligence, poor planning and an invasion before peaceful options had been exhausted. The Chilcot inquiry severely criticised the way the Blair government decided to go to war.
Military action in Iraq might have been necessary at some point, but in March 2003, there was no imminent threat from Saddam Hussein.
179 British service personnel died in the Iraq campaign. Today, a warning from the families that legal action could follow.
We reserve the right ourselves to call specific parties to answer for their actions in the courts if such process is found to be viable.
It was a campaign which cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. Tony Blair says he acted in good faith, but takes full responsibility without exception or excuse.
Here at Westminster, the families and the world's media have been digesting the findings of the report and reacting to the conclusions.
And the other main stories this lunchtime. The South African athlete Oscar Pistorius is sentenced to 6 years in jail for the murder of his girlfriend Reeva Steenkamp. And can they do it? Wales face Portugal tonight, battling for a place in the final of Euro 2016.
In the South, treated as a slave for 5 years. The vulnerable man beaten and forced to sleep in a shed. Now the family responsible are brought to justice. And concern in Sussex over new powers for police community support officers.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. 13 years after the end of the Iraq War, the official verdict on Britain's role in the conflict has been delivered. For 7 years, we've waited for the findings of the inquiry by Sir John Chilcot, and now we have them. Here are some of his main conclusions. The inquiry found that the UK had signed up for the invasion of Iraq before all peaceful options had been exhausted. Military action at that time was not a last resort, it says. Sir John found that there wasn't enough substantive discussion over the legal basis for going to war. That, he said, was far from satisfactory. There was praise for service personnel, but also criticism of the state of the British Army. There were, he said, serious equipment shortfalls when the conflict began. 179 British personnel died in the invasion and in the later campaign. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis lost their lives. Sir John called planning for that period after the invasion wholly inadequate. And then there was the relationship between Tony Blair and the US President George Bush. One memo published today shows the former Prime Minister telling the President, "I will be with you, whatever." Earlier this morning, Tony Blair said he'd taken the decision to go to war in good faith, but said he took full responsibility for any mistakes without exception or excuse. Well, let's cross now to central London and to Ben Brown. Ben.
Yeah, Rita, thank you. Here at the QE2 Centre in Westminster, Sir John Chilcot has finally delivered his conclusions to the world's media, to politicians and indeed to the families of those who died in the Iraq conflict. Well, the report itself is more than 2.5 million words long and covers some 6,000 pages. In a moment, we'll have reaction to it. But first, let's go to our assistant political editor, Norman Smith at Downing Street. Norman, you've been ploughing through the report. Is it, in your view, perhaps stronger in its criticism of the Blair government than you were expecting?
Ben, this report really is a devastating denunciation of pretty much every aspect of the war, from the reasons we went to war to the claims that Saddam Hussein was a threat and had weapons of mass destruction, to the intelligence services and the information they provided, to the legal case for war, to the equipment our troops were sent out to fight with, to the aftermath. And really the only people, it seems to me, to emerge with any credit are our soldiers and civilians who were in Iraq. But the central figure who straddles this whole report and is in pretty much every page is Tony Blair, and the picture that emerges is of a Prime Minister who many months before the war was already determined to get rid of Saddam Hussein, almost despite the doubts, the question marks, the reservations, regardless of his cabinet colleagues who are almost bystanders, so much so that way back in 2001, at the end of 2001, Mr. Blair and Mr. Bush were already privately discussing getting rid of Saddam Hussein through regime change by encouraging a revolt amongst Iraqis, which would be supported by the British and Americans militarily. And then over subsequent months, there are a whole range of memos. In July, Mr. Blair writes to President Bush without the cabinet knowing, saying, "I will be with you whatever." And then in January, he commits to deploying 3 British brigades in southern Iraq, saying war was now the likely option. And I think what we learn from this report is it is highly, highly questionable whether we would have ever gone to war had Tony Blair not been Prime Minister.
All right, Norman, thank you very much. Norman Smith there, our assistant political editor. Well, the Chilcot report has taken 7 years to compile. That's longer than the British deployment in Iraq itself. Our correspondent Nick Witchell reports now on its main findings.
His job is finally done. After 7 years' work, Sir John Chilcot's findings have been published. They amount to a relentless catalogue of failures by significant parts of the British political and intelligence establishments.
We have concluded that the UK chose to join the invasion of Iraq before the peaceful options for disarmament had been exhausted. Military action at that time was not a last resort.
First, on the vital relationship between Prime Minister Blair and the then US President George W. Bush. What did Mr. Blair, seen here leaving his home this morning, what did Mr. Blair commit to when he met Mr. Bush in the United States in 2002? In this previously secret, private memo from Blair to Bush, dated the 28th of July 2002, we get a strong indication. "I will be with you, whatever," wrote Mr. Blair. In Sir John's carefully modulated prose, he writes at paragraph 409 of his report, Mr. Blair's long note of the 28th of July telling President Bush, "I will be with you, whatever," was seen before it was sent only by number 10 officials. It represented an extensive statement of the UK government's position by the Prime Minister to the President of the United States. The Foreign and Defence Secretaries should certainly have been given an opportunity to comment on the draft in advance. Then to the use, or some might say the misuse, of intelligence.
It is now clear that policy on Iraq was made on the basis of flawed intelligence and assessments. They were not challenged, and they should have been.
On the 24th of September 2002, Mr. Blair made a statement to Parliament
The intelligence picture they paint is one
in which he claimed the intelligence on Iraq's weapons of mass destruction was extensive and detailed. Not true, says Sir John Chilcot.
The judgments about Iraq's capabilities in that statement and in the dossier published the same day were presented with a certainty that was not justified. The Joint Intelligence Committee should have made clear to Mr. Blair that the assessed intelligence had not established beyond doubt either that Iraq had continued to produce chemical and biological weapons or that efforts to develop nuclear weapons continued.
On the vexed issue of the legality of the war, Sir John makes it clear that the inquiry does not express a view, but
we have, however, concluded that the circumstances in which it was decided that there was a legal basis for UK military action were far from satisfactory.
The advice of the then Attorney General Lord Goldsmith was critical to the question of legality, but the report makes it clear that his conclusions were never properly explored by the Cabinet. Paragraph 449 states, although Lord Goldsmith was invited to attend Cabinet on the 16th of January, there was no discussion of Lord Goldsmith's views. Paragraph 490 says, there was little appetite in Cabinet to question Lord Goldsmith about his advice and no substantive discussion of the legal issues was recorded. Paragraph 493, Lord Goldsmith should have been asked to provide written evidence which fully explained the legal basis on which the UK could take military action. Those findings point to another of the report's recurring themes, the style of Mr Blair's government, with discussions confined to small groups of officials and the cabinet often excluded from decisions. And so finally to the chaos of post-invasion Iraq and the failures to provide British troops with adequate equipment and the absence of a clear plan.
Mr Blair told the inquiry that the difficulties encountered in Iraq after the invasion could not have been known in advance. We do not agree that hindsight is required. The risks of internal strife in Iraq, active Iranian pursuit of its interests, regional instability, and al-Qaeda activity in Iraq were each explicitly identified before the invasion.
Across page after page after page, Sir John Chilcot has catalogued the path to what he suggests was an unwarranted invasion based on flawed intelligence with insufficient debate within government, an intervention which caused immense anguish in Britain and in Iraq.
The UK military role in Iraq ended a very long way from success. We have sought to set out the government's actions on Iraq fully and impartially. The evidence is there for all to see. It is an account of an intervention which went badly wrong, with consequences to this day.
Nicholas Witchell, BBC News, at the Chilcot inquiry.
Well, the purpose of the Chilcot inquiry has been to examine the circumstances which led to the invasion of Iraq and the decisions taken by politicians at the time. And the report, as we've seen, has found serious shortcomings in both intelligence and military preparedness. And as our political correspondent Eleanor Garnier now reports, condemnation of the actions of those who took Britain to war has been swift.
At the centre of today's scrutiny, Tony Blair, the man whose decision it was, along with the US President George Bush, to invade Iraq. Years on, still unable to shake off the legacy of war. A conflict that continues to cast a shadow over British foreign policy and its politicians.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The circumstances in which it was ultimately decided that there was a legal basis for UK participation were far from satisfactory. Sir John also finds that the diplomatic options had not at that stage been exhausted, and that, and I quote, military action was therefore not a last resort.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Frankly, it was an act of military aggression launched on a false pretext, as the inquiry accepts, and has long been regarded as illegal by the overwhelming weight of international legal opinion.
Tony Blair's decision to invade Iraq followed a vote here in Westminster, where MPs authorised military action. It remains one of the most controversial foreign policy decisions of the last 50 years. Moments after the Chilcot report was published, Mr Blair said, "I took it in good faith and in what I believe to be the best interests of the country. I will take full responsibility for any mistakes without exception or excuse." But those who believe the invasion was wrong claim Mr Blair was fixated on going to war.
Well, there's a clear contrast, a stark contrast between Mr Blair's absolute ruthless determination to go to war, almost no matter the evidence, on the one hand, and on the other hand, his complete failure and the government's failure to plan at all for what happened next.
People who are looking for a real devastating critique might be disappointed, but it really says the whole thing was pretty disastrous and we didn't need to go with America. We should have made our own judgment. They chose the date. There was no urgency to go on that date. Everything could have been better organised.
It's taken years to write and will likely take many more to know if lessons have been learnt. And will Britain and its politicians ever be able to shake off the legacy of Iraq? Eleanor Garnier, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, the Chilcot report is 4 times the length of War and Peace, and families and relatives of the British servicemen and women who died in Iraq say it will take time to absorb all the findings, days or even weeks, but they will consider the possibility of legal action against Tony Blair and members of his government. Rita, back to you.
Ben, thank you very much. Ben Brown there. Well, 179 UK service personnel were killed in the Iraq campaign, and as Ben said there, today their relatives said they were considering legal action over their deaths. One said their son had died in vain. Our correspondent Christian Fraser reports now on how the relatives have responded to the findings of the inquiry.
There'll be no other reason for three people in uniform to turn up at your gate other than to tell you some bad news. And that's what it was. That was just horrendous.
Birthdays are special in any family, particularly for the parents of twins. But for Doug and Liz Rigby, June 22nd is bittersweet, perhaps even a day to dread. For on the day he turned 24, their son John died in a field hospital in Basra, fatally wounded by the shrapnel from a roadside bomb. His twin brother Will, also in Iraq, in the same regiment, the 4th Battalion, the Rifles, held John's hand as he died.
I remember Will saying that the young lad that was with him just put a little piece of gauze over the hole in his head. And that really touched me.
In 2009, the families were told this inquiry would report within a year. It's taken 7.
This whole process, because it's taken so long, this whole process has trawled up for us issues that frankly, for our own benefit and our family's benefit, we had put to bed. And inevitably it's brought it all back.
Another soldier who died while out on patrol was Private Lee Ellis, a paratrooper from the 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment. He was filmed in 2006 by a BBC Panorama team on the very day he died. Of 179 British servicemen and women killed in Iraq, 37 died in these lightly armoured Land Rovers. They were dubbed by the soldiers the mobile coffins.
They weren't fit for purpose. They were built for Northern Ireland, for stones, for bottles, not for IEDs and not for mortar shells.
It will take days, maybe weeks, to digest fully what this report says, but already the families believe it provides a basis to explore prosecutions.
That healing, that 11 and a half years I've worked for, I've gone back to that time when I learned that my brother had been killed. And there is one terrorist in this world that the world needs to be aware of, and his name's Tony Blair, the world's worst terrorist.
Answers may be blame apportioned, but for the families, there's nothing that can fill the void or ever remove the pain.
When walking through here, I did with John a lot with the dogs, and when I came after he died, I always used to go like this. I used to feel him on my right shoulder. It was a really warm, nice feeling. It used to make me smile.
Christian Fraser, BBC News.
Well, one of the most controversial aspects in the run-up to the invasion was the role of the intelligence services and the production of what became known as the dodgy dossiers. Well, today the Chilcot report criticised the work of MI6, describing its assessment of the danger posed by Saddam Hussein as flawed. Here's our security correspondent, Frank Gardner.
The role of MI6 and of the wider intelligence community in the run-up to the Iraq War was one of the worst intelligence failures of our time. Today's Chilcot report states that policy on Iraq was made on the basis of flawed intelligence and assessments. They were not challenged, and they should have been. Iraq, under the late President Saddam Hussein, was a notoriously difficult place to spy on. Saddam had informers everywhere. But Washington and Whitehall were desperate to acquire any intelligence on Iraq's suspected chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons programs. UN weapons inspectors have been searching Iraq for evidence of these throughout the 1990s. Saddam's regime behaved as if it were hiding something. In fact, those programs were destroyed in 1991 or soon after. But in Whitehall, in the run-up to the invasion, the Joint Intelligence Committee seized on what turned out to be flimsy and poorly assessed intelligence supplied by MI6. The Chilcot report says judgments about the severity of the threat posed by Iraq's weapons of mass destruction were presented with a certainty that wasn't justified. It adds that the assessed intelligence had not established beyond doubt that Saddam Hussein continued to produce chemical and biological weapons. MI6, Britain's secret intelligence service, comes out badly from the Chilcot report because it confirms in stark words that the intelligence on Iraq was wrong and it needed to have been rigorously and independently challenged by people other than those who gathered it. Since then, that service has undergone a root and branch reorganisation. Today, raw material supplied by intelligence case officers is independently assessed and challenged by others. For MI6, the Chilcot report still makes uncomfortable reading, but by now, its lessons should be well and truly learnt. Frank Gardner, BBC News.
The military mission in Iraq lasted 6 years and no one actually knows how many Iraqis have been killed since the invasion. Estimates range from 90,000 to over 500,000. Caroline Hawley, the BBC's correspondent in Baghdad in the period after the invasion, reports now on the legacy of the conflict and how Iraq continues to be affected.
No one knows exactly how many Iraqis have been killed since 2003. But the latest estimate by Iraq Body Count puts the figure at 250,000, and it rises every day. Iraq under Saddam Hussein was a place of terrible fear for anyone who dared to challenge him. But his overthrow was to open a Pandora's box and bring in its wake a new kind of fear.
This is an absolutely devastating blow, and not just for the UN, but also for the American-led administration here.
I lived in Iraq for 3 years and watched the chaos unfold. It may never have turned out well, but a whole catalogue of failures and mistakes doomed the American-British project.
Will you get off, please? We don't need any more casualties.
Iraq's borders had not been sealed. The country had become a magnet for jihadis. The decision to disband the security forces and purge the state of Baathists was a gift to the insurgency, giving it new recruits. Even Iraqis desperate to see the end of Saddam Hussein's dictatorship were soon angry and bitter. For all the talk of liberating them, they didn't feel that their interests mattered. The reconstruction effort was slow, plagued by insecurity, corruption, missteps. By the end of 2011, all British and American troops were out, but they left behind a country fractured along sectarian lines, fertile ground for a lethal new threat to grow. The group which calls itself Islamic State. For many Iraqis, the war never ended, and the anger is still raw. We reaped nothing from their invasion, only destruction, this man says. From 2003, our country has been a scene of killing, massacres, explosions and sectarianism. Last weekend, at least 250 people were killed in one bombing. When, people ask, will Iraq's suffering stop? Caroline Hawley, BBC News.
Well, our Middle East editor Jeremy Bowen is in Baghdad for us now. And Jeremy, there was strong criticism in the report of post-war planning. And as we've just seen, Iraq continues to suffer the consequences to this day.
Yet people in Iraq live and die with the consequences of the 2003 invasion. Now, what happened then is not the only reason why Iraq is in the state that it's in. There, for example, has been a lot of interference by Iran. But the point the report makes, which I think is really salient, is that the government at the time, the British government, was warned of the potential consequences. Consequences of increased al-Qaeda activity, internal trouble inside Iraq, Iran meddling, and also trouble in the wider region. Now, it chose to ignore all of that, but all of those things have subsequently come to pass.
Jeremy, thank you. And the time is coming up to 25 minutes past 1, our top story this lunchtime. The Chilcot report into Britain's role in the Iraq War has concluded the government chose to join the 2003 invasion before all options had been exhausted. It highlights flawed intelligence and inadequate planning. And still to come, Wales fans get ready to cheer their team on against Portugal in tonight's semi-final of Euro 2016.
And in South today, he was kept as a slave for 5 years. The vulnerable man beaten and forced to sleep in a shed. Now the family responsible are brought to justice. And concern in Sussex over new powers for police community support officers.
The South African athlete Oscar Pistorius has been sentenced to 6 years in prison for the murder of his girlfriend Reeva Steenkamp in 2013. The recommended term was 15 years. Our correspondent Karen Allen reports now from Pretoria.
An undignified end to a fallen hero. Oscar Pistorius is led away to jail to begin his 6-year sentence for murder. For the father of Reeva Steenkamp, whose testimony revealed how his life had been torn apart, just relief that it was over. Inside a packed courtroom, a sense of hushed expectation, as the judge said she needed to strike a balance between deterrence, punishment and the seriousness of the crime.
By its very nature, punishment is unpleasant, it is uncomfortable, it is painful, and it's inconvenient. It is certainly not what you love to do. Mr. Pistorius?
Then the athlete is asked to stand.
In the result, the sentence that I impose on the accused for the murder dolus eventualis of the deceased, that is Reeva Steenkamp, is 6 years imprisonment.
The family of Reeva Steenkamp, drained of emotion, appeared to be stunned that this day had finally come.
A 6-year sentence means that Oscar Pistorius will have to serve at least 3 years before being eligible for parole. He begged the world to believe that it had all been a terrible mistake, the judge exercising considerable discretion. Now, for the grieving family of Reeva Steenkamp, perhaps a censure.
It's now more than 3 years since this couple's fate hit the headlines after the athlete fired 4 shots through a closed bathroom door, killing Reeva. In the court case that followed, Oscar Pistorius was found guilty of manslaughter, but a year later it was converted to murder on appeal. This is the prison where Oscar Pistorius has already spent time for manslaughter, but he returns now a convicted murderer. Today marked the closing chapter of what has been a marathon case. Oscar Pistorius, crushed, broken and said to be full of remorse. A man once hailed a sporting legend. Karen Allen, BBC News, Pretoria.
Now tonight, Wales face the biggest match in their history when they take on Portugal in the semi-finals of Euro 2016. The match will be Wales's first ever major championship semi-final. They're also the first British nation to make it to this stage of a championship for 20 years. Thousands of Wales fans have made the journey to Lyon, as Hal Griffiths reports.
Ready for takeoff, already high on a feeling few have ever felt before. This is Wales' incredible journey. The last time they even played in a major tournament was in 1958, the year David was born. This was worth the wait.
What is just happening? It's an incredible dream. It's the players and the managers, the management have delivered what we wanted, a tournament. They've gone way beyond that now.
These players haven't just reached new heights in Welsh football, they've surpassed every British team for the last 20 years. How? It's sticking together in hard times and enjoying the good ones.
It's great laughs, great scenes. We're enjoying ourselves, enjoying each other's company as we have been doing for a long time. And yeah, just seeing everybody happy and enjoying the moment is more than enough for everybody.
Tonight is a test of that team mentality for Portugal too. They need to prove they're more than the sum of their rather expensive parts. Whatever happens tonight, David and his son know, as football fans, these are the days you have to savour and bask in the warmth of the French sun.
We do feel like we have a golden generation, because we do have a golden generation, and it's unreal, really.
Somewhere along this journey, things have changed for Welsh supporters too. After decades of dealing with defeat, well, now everyone seems to believe that maybe this isn't the end of the line. Maybe they could go all the way to the final in Paris on Sunday.
Howell Griffith, BBC News, Lyon.
More now on the findings of the Chilcot inquiry into the Iraq War. Let's get some reaction from Washington and our correspondent Gary O'Donoghue, who's there for us. Gary, we've been waiting years for this, so too, no doubt, have people in the US. What are they saying?
Well, it's pretty early days here at the moment in terms of their absorption of this report and its details. And of course, they have been through similar processes here, examining the failure of intelligence, the criticisms of that, and of course, various senior politicians having to reassess their position, notably Hillary Clinton, on voting for the war in the first place. I think there will be a lot of interest in this relationship between Tony Blair and George W. Bush. We see that detailed in the 30 separate notes that Tony Blair wrote to President Bush. Particularly also there'll be, I think, some reaction to the nature of the relationship between Britain and the US. John Chilcot in his report said that Tony Blair overestimated his ability to influence US decision-making, and that will reverberate, I think, around diplomatic communities. And he said that really there wasn't a need for unconditional support. And again, that will be something that people will absorb here. But this will have implications, I think, for the relationship going forward, without question.
OK, Gary, many thanks. Gary O'Donoghue there. And you can find more information and reaction to the Chilcot report on our website. That's at bbc.co.uk/Chilcot. And you'll find analysis of all aspects of the report there. And let's take a look at the weather now. Here's Thomas Schaffenacker. Thomas.
Rita, thank you. Some lovely weather out there. Sort of spot of lunch if you can. Some nice cloud formations as well. Here's a halo. So we've got those ice crystals high up there in the atmosphere. One picture sent in by our weather watchers. And apart from that, in the last few days, we've also been seeing these classic cirrus clouds. And I've got a really spectacular one to show you here. Cirrus... Oh. Here we go, it flipped through, never mind. The wispy cirrus clouds are usually found at the edge of these weather fronts here, and they're streamed in by this jet stream. So that's why we're seeing these lovely cloud formations. So that's the jet stream, that's the weather front being brought in by that ribbon of air. It's bringing thick cloud and outbreaks of rain to parts of western Scotland and also into Northern Ireland as well, where it's been pretty damp. But further south, this is where the fine weather is. This is where we've got the sunshine. But remember, the sun's turned quite hazy. And actually, through the course of today, those skies will turn cloudier and cloudier across these western areas. But it's warm enough. And, you know, one good thing about the weather today is that the winds are pretty light. So that's why it feels pleasantly warm. And the weather should be fine there in Lyon as well for that important match this evening. Temperatures should be around 23 degrees there underneath those bright sunny skies. Now, through this evening, we've got this southwesterly flow of air. So that means that the temperatures will be quite on the high side. I don't think any lower than around about 14 or 15 quite widely across England and Wales, 12 degrees in Scotland. And then tomorrow, again, we're in this stream of moisture. There's a lot of cloud. There's lots of weather fronts. Here's one here if I get out of the way. That's heading our way for the weekend. We'll talk about that in a second because it's not looking too great. But in terms of the weather for Thursday, I think this central swathe of the UK, outbreaks of rain, nothing too heavy, cloud at times, but I think towards the southeast, maybe some sunshine, temperatures in the low 20s. Looks like the lowlands of Scotland and Northern Ireland will also get a little bit of brightness. Now, come Friday, we're still in that fairly sort of muggy air mass across the south. So Thursday and Friday looking pretty muggy in the south, a bit fresher across the north. And then all eyes to the west of us, because this is where this area of low pressure will start to swing in. It's not welcome this time of the year. A lot of isobars here. To be honest, it looks like something out of an autumn picture. Could be gale force winds around some of these western coasts. So really blustery, I think, at least first half of the weekend. Things will turn to calm down a little bit as we get into Sunday. But for Saturday, expect blustery weather, bits and pieces of rain, but there's inevitably going to be a bit of sunshine around as well. Back to you.
Thank you, Thomas. A reminder now of our top story this lunchtime. The Chilcot report into Britain's role in the Iraq War has concluded the government chose to join the 2003 invasion before all peaceful options had been exhausted. It highlights flawed intelligence and inadequate planning. It was a campaign which cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. Tony Blair says he acted in good faith but takes full responsibility without exception or excuse. Well, that's all from us. Now on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.